She slammed her fists against my door so hard the frame rattled, her voice echoing across the lake as she shrieked, "Open up, Ryan! My guests are here and you're ruining everything!" My guests? Her guests? No. This was my cabin, my sanctuary, my property. And in that moment, staring at Marlene, the self-appointed queen and president of the HOA, I knew this wasn't going to be a misunderstanding. It was going to be war. But before I dive in, if you've ever had an HOA nightmare or a neighbor who thought they could control your life, hit like, subscribe, and share this story, because you won't believe how far this one went. My name's Ryan, and I bought this cabin 3 years ago, tucked just outside the HOA boundary, close enough to irritate them, close enough for the glares and tight smiles at community gatherings, but not close enough for their rules to reach me, or at least that's what I thought. This place was supposed to be peace. Tall pines, still water, a fire pit, a dock, loons in the morning and crickets at night. But peace has enemies, and mine had a name, Marlene. From the very beginning, she treated me like an intruder, dropping comments about shared values and community standards, knowing full well she had no authority over me, and she hated it. For 3 years, it was nothing more than stares and clipped words, until one Friday morning when everything changed. I'd taken the week off, packed steaks and beer, ready for fishing and hammock naps, but when I turned into my driveway, the road was lined with luxury SUVs and a massive banner strung between my pines. "Welcome Lakeview Retreat guests." I sat stunned in my truck until Marlene appeared, sunglasses perched like a crown, pastel blazer blinding, clipboard in hand, and with the confidence of someone who believed she owned everything, she said, "Oh good, you made it. Little mix-up with the lodge. So I told our guests we'd use your cabin for overflow. Just unlock it, and I'll handle everything." I stared, waiting for her to laugh, but she didn't. She just pointed at my door like it was a spare shed. "You... what?" I asked. "Your place," she insisted. "Just 2 nights. We'll clean up afterward." My jaw clenched as I told her flatly, "You figured wrong." Her fake smile cracked, and without another word, she stormed off. The rest of the day, HOA members streamed toward the dock with tables and coolers, laughter and music carrying across the trees, and all I could picture was strangers inside my home, touching my things, sleeping in my bed. That evening, just as the sky turned gold, I heard rustling at the back door, then the metallic scrape of bolt cutters. Heart pounding, I peeked through the blinds. 2 shadows crouched at the lock. I flipped on the porch light, slammed the glass, and they bolted into the woods. I called the sheriff, relief fading when I saw who arrived. Marlene's nephew, leaning against his cruiser like I'd inconvenienced him, sighing, "Sir, my Aunt Marlene says this is a misunderstanding. Maybe you could be more neighborly." "Neighborly?" "Neighborly doesn't mean handing over my home to strangers," I snapped. But he didn't write a thing, didn't check the door, just left. Alone under the floodlight, I stood staring at the lake until silence returned. But peace didn't last. The next morning, a neon orange notice was taped to my door. Violation of HOA Code 14B, failure to participate in community activities. I wasn't even in the HOA. I crumpled it, tossed it into the fireplace, and let it burn. Later, at the diner in town, 2 women at the next booth buzzed about their weekend retreat, one showing photos on her phone, and my stomach dropped. It was my cabin, my dock, my hammock, listed online as Lakefront Escape, nearly $1,000 per guest. She hadn't just pushed, she hadn't just bullied. She'd stolen my photos, stolen my property, and was selling it like it was hers. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't about neighborly disputes or community spirit. It was about control, about power. And Marlene had just decided my home belonged to her. She was wrong. Because if she wanted a war, I was ready. The next morning I learned quickly that Marlene wasn't going to back off. She was going to escalate, and she was going to do it fast. I woke up to the sound of a white utility truck crunching down my driveway, 2 men in orange vests stepping out with clipboards like they owned the place. They didn't knock, didn't introduce themselves, just started circling my cabin, measuring the dock, snapping photos of my flower beds, muttering about violations. When I asked what the hell they were doing, one finally said, HOA compliance. Inspection. I told him flatly, I'm not in your HOA. And without even looking at me, the other one shrugged and said, that's under review. Take it up at the next board meeting. By the time they left, an orange flag was staked in my garden that read, pending review, as if my property was theirs to assess. I took pictures, sent them to my lawyer, who told me not to touch a thing, just keep documenting. That's when I realized her game wasn't to prove she had power. It was to bury me in fake paperwork until I broke. And she didn't stop there. A day later, my Aunt Ruth called, furious. She was still on an old HOA email list and said Marlene had blasted out a message warning that I was planning to sell my cabin to a developer, calling it a crisis that required urgent action. Ruth pushed back, asked for proof, and minutes later the whole email thread vanished. That was when I knew this wasn't just harassment, it was a campaign. I asked Ruth to dig out the old bylaws and zoning maps, anything proving I was outside their reach. She promised she would. Meanwhile, I wasn't going to sit around waiting. I installed trail cameras along the property line and by the dock, determined to catch whoever kept creeping around. For a few nights I only caught deer, until one evening the floodlights snapped on and there she was, one of Marlene's assistants, crouched by my tool shed, tape measure in hand. She bolted into the trees when the light hit, but the next day her nameplate was hanging in the HOA office, Property Compliance Officer. Another pawn in Marlene's game. But the more she schemed, the sloppier she got. Every violation notice, every forged letter, every late-night trespass was evidence, and my folder was filling. Then came the barbecue that changed everything. I invited a few neighbors, people who had felt Marlene's heavy hand before. Over burgers and beer, the stories poured out. Alan fined for hanging his canoe under his deck. Denise swearing Marlene rewrote meeting minutes to erase a vote. Another family told to take down their daughter's tree swing. By the time the EI fire pit burned low, we'd formed an unspoken alliance. We were tired of her games, tired of living like hostages in our own homes. And then came the breaking point. Saturday morning, engines rumbled again. Dozens of SUVs lined the field, guests in sundresses and polo shirts unloading coolers, taking selfies. Marlene stood at the dock like she was hosting a red carpet gala. Tables lined with catered food, banners strung across the trees. The whole thing was branded as a lake retreat. And sure enough, before long, they made their way toward my gate. One woman stepped forward with a printed confirmation in her hand, my cabin address, my name, promising full weekend access. She'd wired $800 to one of Marlene's assistants. I told her calmly, "This is my private property. I never listed it." Her face fell, her voice cracked, and she admitted she'd been conned. Then she surprised me. She offered to give a written statement, saying no one else should get scammed. That was the moment the cracks spread. Word traveled fast through the crowd, guests whispering, checking phones, demanding answers. Some packed up and left, others shouted for refunds. By late afternoon, the retreat was in shambles. The music cut off, decorations sagged, and Marlene scrambled desperately from group to group, her smile a mask of panic. And just when it couldn't get worse for her, the sheriff showed up. Not her nephew this time, but a no-nonsense deputy who listened as I laid out my folder of evidence. The fake listings, the bogus citations, the trail cam footage of trespassers. He nodded, said it looked like fraud, and told me it would depend on whether the guests pressed charges. At least one already had. By sunset, the event grounds looked like a battlefield. Trash blowing across the grass, guests furious, cars peeling. Out. And there was Marlene, standing at the dock, shouting at volunteers as they tore down her fantasy retreat. I watched from my porch, and realized one thing. This wasn't over. She'd been exposed, humiliated, but a woman like Marlene doesn't. Crawl away quietly, she reloads. The retreat disaster should have been the end of it, but instead it lit a fuse, because Marlene didn't disappear. She came back swinging harder. The morning after her guests stormed off, I found a notice duct-taped to my gate that read, Preliminary Acquisition Assessment Zone. It had county letterhead and legal jargon, but the font was wrong, the signature line blank, a sloppy forgery. I drove into town and handed it to the zoning clerk, who shook his head immediately and said, Fake, flat-out impersonation of county authority. Whoever did this could be charged. He printed me certified copies of the zoning map, black and white. Proof my cabin was outside HOA jurisdiction. I felt like I had just loaded a bullet with her name on it. But back home, the sabotage only escalated. One of my trail cameras caught a hooded figure creeping onto my deck in the middle of the night, twisting the doorknob before vanishing into the trees. When I froze the footage, my stomach turned. It was the same assistant who'd been promoted to compliance officer. Days later, I walked into my garden to find my irrigation line sliced clean through, peppers and tomatoes wilting in the say. Sun. Not an accident, not nature. A deliberate surgical cut. I added the stills to my evidence folder, labeled it Sabotage, and mailed a backup drive to my lawyer. If Marlene thought fear would break me, she miscalculated. But the truth was, she wasn't just trying to scare me anymore. She was trying to rewrite reality. Guests still arrived at the diner in town, waving confirmations for lakefront stays. That didn't exist, confused when I told them I never listed my cabin. One woman even showed me her phone, her wire transfer receipt, her text exchanges with a number she thought belonged to the HOA. She looked gutted when she realized she'd been conned, but then she did something remarkable. She said she'd put it in writing. That story spread like wildfire online, bouncing around the private community board. Others piled on. Guests who'd paid cash, neighbors who'd been told lies, people finally connecting the dots. And the whispers turned into open questions. If Marlene could rent out a property she didn't own, what else had she been doing? The final straw came when she tried to host another mini-retreat the following weekend, parading around with a consultant in a suit and a woman clutching a community-first coffee mug. She stood at the edge of my driveway, smiling like a realtor pitching beachfront property, calling it a revitalization project, and urging me to unlock my cabin so the consultant could take a look inside. I leaned against my doorframe and said nothing, silence cutting sharper than any argument. Within minutes, the consultant backed away, clearly realizing he'd been duped. The entourage left in clipped silence, Marlene's face twitching with rage as she tried to hold her smile. That's when I knew. Her empire wasn't just cracking, it was collapsing. But Marlene wasn't going to surrender. No. She called an emergency HOA board meeting. And this time, I wouldn't just walk in as the target of her wrath. I'd walk in with the folder that could end her presidency for good. The night before the emergency board meeting, I barely slept. My evidence folder sat on the table like a loaded weapon, stuffed with screenshots of fake rental listings, forged violation notices, trail cam stills of trespassers, the contractor's unpaid invoice, even the zoning map stamped by the county proving my land was untouchable. And tucked in the middle was the golden bullet. A clause from the original bylaws Ruth had dug out of her father's papers that clearly stated any president caught profiteering. Off-community assets could be removed immediately by board vote. When I pulled into the community hall the next evening, the lot was packed with cars, neighbors standing in clusters whispering, some giving me nods of encouragement, others avoiding eye contact, but everyone knew this wasn't a routine meeting. Inside, the air was tight and buzzing with tension, phones already up recording, and there she sat at the head of the table, Marlene back straight, hair perfect, papers stacked neatly as if nothing had cracked. But I saw her fingers drumming against the wood and her smile twitching at the corners. When the floor opened, I stood, walked forward, and dropped my folder on the table with a thud that made half the room jump. I opened it piece by piece. First, the screenshots of my cabin plastered across booking sites under names like Lakefront Escape and Lakeside Bliss, complete with fake reviews. Then the stack of neon-colored violation notices accusing me of mailbox infractions and visual obstruction of community sightlines. Then the photographs from my trail cams. Grainy, yes, but clear enough to recognize the assistant Marlene had promoted creeping across my deck with a hood pulled tight. Then came the statements. The woman who wired $800 for a fake stay, the contractor still unpaid, the neighbors who spoke of fines for canoes, swings, trellises. One by one I laid them out like cards, and with each page the air grew heavier, until I pulled the final slip of paper, the bylaw clause. I read it aloud slowly, the words slicing the room like a blade. Any president caught profiteering through misrepresentation may be removed by immediate vote. For the first time, Marlene's mask cracked. Her lips parted, her hands trembled. Her voice stammered as she tried to deflect blame onto rogue volunteers, claiming she'd never authorized the listings, never told anyone to trespass, never took a dime. But then the woman who'd been scammed stood up in the crowd, holding her confirmation printout, her voice cutting sharp and raw as she said, "When I asked for my money back, Marlene told me to stop causing problems. She made me feel like it was my fault, but it wasn't. And now I know I wasn't the only one." Phones caught every word. Neighbors murmured in agreement, and even Marlene's loyalists looked away in shame. Ruth rose next, reading out a list of past infractions scrubbed from records, each one traced back to Marlene's hand. Then the contractor raised his invoice, voice steady as he said he didn't want revenge, only honesty. By the time the board called the vote, the outcome was clear. Hands rose, one after another, unanimous. Effective immediately, Marlene was removed. She gathered her papers silently, face pale as chalk, and walked out, the door closing behind her with a finality that rippled through the room like a stone hitting water. The neighbors exhaled, some even clapping, but I didn't join them. Because, as my phone buzzed in my pocket, I pulled it out and read the message glowing on the screen from an unknown number. 4 words that turned my relief cold. This isn't finished yet. When the board voted Marlene out, the room exhaled like someone had opened a window after years of stale air, and for a few hours I let myself believe it was over, that I could finally sit on my porch with a coffee and hear nothing but loons. On the lake again. But that text still burned in my pocket. This isn't finished yet. For days afterward I jumped at shadows, expecting her to show up with bolt cutters again or find my cabin spray-painted in the night. But nothing came. Instead, she vanished, her pastel blazers gone from meetings, her SUV missing from its usual spot, her name scrubbed from the HOA letterhead. Some said she'd packed up and left town. Others claimed she was hiding out with relatives, maybe even plotting in some other neighborhood. But I stopped caring. Her shadow was gone, and with it the suffocating grip she had held over everyone. The lake began to breathe again. Neighbors who had kept their heads down for years suddenly painted their fences in colors Marlene would have fined them for. Blues, reds, yellows. Wind chimes jingled on porches. Garden gnomes reappeared in flower. Beds. A family strung up a tree swing for their daughter, something Marlene once declared a safety hazard. It was like life rushed back in color after years of gray. Noreen, the new acting president, sent out her first message not as a warning or fine, but as an invitation to a town hall where anyone could speak. People showed up, smiling, laughing, even arguing, but without fear. My cabin? Quiet. No more orange stakes in my flower beds, no forged notices slapped on my gate, no late-night trespassers creeping along the deck. For the first time since this nightmare began, silence meant peace, not anticipation. Of course, the wreckage she left behind didn't vanish overnight. Lawsuits rolled in. Scammed guests filed reports. The contractor pressed for his payment. Vendors revealed she stiffed them for catering and decorations. The sheriff's office called me once or twice, but I had already given them everything. The evidence folder, the thumb drive, the trail cam footage. It wasn't my fight anymore. Neighbors, though, they didn't forget. They stopped me on walks, thanked me quietly. Joel brought me apples from his orchard. Denise left a jar of jam on my porch. Paula baked me a pie and said it was long, overdue. One man I hardly knew shook my hand and told me, "You reminded us we didn't have to take her crap." That stuck with me. I hadn't set out to be anyone's example. All I ever wanted was to be left alone. But somehow, standing my ground had done more than keep my cabin safe. It had reminded the whole lake that they still had a voice. Weeks passed, summer turning to fall, and the place felt alive again. Kids paddled near the shore, families grilled on porches without worrying about smoke drift violations. Even a weekend art market popped up on the common grounds, something Marlene had once shut down for being too informal. Funny thing was, I finally didn't feel like an outsider anymore. Then one morning, tucked under a smooth river stone at my gate, I found a note written in neat cursive on floral stationery. "Thank you for not backing down. You helped all of us." No name, no signature. I stood there holding it, smiling in a way I hadn't in months, not out of defiance, but peace. I slid it into the same folder where I'd once stuffed every scrap of evidence. That folder used to feel like a weapon, heavy with proof. Now it felt like a reminder of what we'd survived. A week later, I made a choice. When Noreen invited me to join a liaison group between the HOA and non-HOA owners, I said yes, not because I craved power, but because I wanted to make sure no one else would get steamrolled the way I had. At that meeting, people didn't glare at me as the rogue outsider anymore. They nodded, smiled, even thanked me. The mood was lighter, almost hopeful. Driving home, I saw kids kayaking, families laughing by fires, no shouting, no fake citations, just life. Pulling into my driveway, I spotted a group of teenagers taking selfies by the welcome sign, laughing, pointing at me, and one of them joked, "That's the guy who kept the cabin locked." I couldn't help but smile. If that was my legacy, I could live with it. The strangest thing was how quickly Marlene's name vanished from conversation, like the community had collectively decided to erase her. Rumors swirled that she moved to another state, maybe tried her tricks in a gated neighborhood 2 towns over, but I didn't care. Let her be someone else's cautionary tale. By early autumn, the leaves turned gold, the air crisp, the lake still. One night I sat by the fire pit, blanket around my shoulders, listening to the frogs croak and the wind in the pines, and I slept with the windows open for the first time in months. Not because I was careless, but because I was safe. A few weeks later, Noreen asked me to tell my story at a community gathering. At first I resisted. I wasn't a speaker, and I didn't want to be a hero. But Ruth nudged me, saying, "Ryan, what you did matters." So I stood by the fire pit under the stars. Neighbors gathered around, and I told them everything. The day Marlene pounded on my door, the bolt cutters, the fake notices, the trespassing, the retreat scam, the boardroom showdown. I told them how it felt to be treated like a trespasser on my own land, and how it felt to win, not with fists or shouting, but with patience, with proof, with a door that stayed locked. When I finished, no one clapped, no one cheered. They just nodded quietly, and somehow that was better because it meant they understood. Looking back now, I realized this was never just about a cabin. It was about boundaries, respect, the line between power and abuse. Marlene thought she could bully me out, bury me in fake citations, scare me into compliance. She was wrong. And in the end, her empire collapsed not because I screamed the loudest, but because I didn't move. The cabin is still mine. The door is still locked. The lake is quiet again. And that's enough. So if you've ever faced down an HOA bully, if you've ever had a neighbor who thought they owned you, hear me, you're not powerless. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stand your ground, That's what I did. And it worked. Dot. So if you've made it this far into my story, do me one last favor. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, share it with anyone who's dealt with an HOA nightmare, and drop your story in the comments below. Let's make sure none of us ever feel alone in the fight again.